His name was printed on the ferry list. His return ticket was paid. But when the last boat left Rockview Island in 2012, David Miller was nowhere to be found. 13 years later, his family is still waiting. And America is still asking, how can a man vanish in broad daylight, surrounded by witnesses? The Oregon coast shimmered in the fading light of a summer afternoon. Waves lapped against the wooden pylons of Rockview Harbor, where the last ferry of the day prepared to depart. Families hurried up the gangway with bags of souvenirs. Couples leaned close, savoring the golden hour. Crew members worked quickly down the manifest, calling each name in turn. David Miller. The voice rang out, sharp above the gulls. Passengers glanced around, waiting for someone to step forward. No one did. The name was called again, louder this time. Still, the space remained empty. His ticket was purchased. His name was printed clearly on the passenger list. But David Miller never appeared. Some remembered fragments. A clerk swore she had sold him a silver gull keychain that afternoon. A college student thought she'd seen a tall man in a dark shirt climbing the trail. A dock worker claimed someone asked him about the ferry schedule around 3 o'clock. Each memory frayed at the edges, uncertain, shifting under the weight of time. The ferry horn sounded. The ropes were cast off. Slowly, the vessel pulled away, leaving behind an island bathed in sunset. And a man who, by all accounts, should have been on board. That was July 2012. An ordinary day for dozens of tourists. Yet for one family in Seattle, it became the beginning of a nightmare without end. Now, 13 years later, the question remains as haunting as ever. How does a man vanish in broad daylight, surrounded by witnesses, cameras, and schedules? And why has no one, to this day, been able to bring David Miller home? David Miller was not a man who fit the script of a mystery. At 35, his life in Seattle was steady, even ordinary, woven with the routines and small joys most Americans would recognize. Neighbors saw him trimming hedges on Saturday mornings, waving politely as children biked down the street. On summer evenings, he grilled hamburgers in the backyard, his young daughter Sophie giggling beside him as she chased fireflies. At work, colleagues remembered him as dependable. The kind of IT technician who solved problems quietly, without fuss. You could always count on David to stay late if someone's computer crashed, one coworker later told reporters. He was not a man who craved the spotlight. He found pride in reliability, in being the steady hand when others panicked. Friends described his weekends spent in the Cascades. Hiking boots muddy, camera slung around his neck, he captured waterfalls spilling over moss-covered rocks or mountain peaks fading into clouds. His Nikon wasn't fancy, but he treated each photo like a window into peace. Emily, his wife, often joked that David's heart belonged half to her, half to the Pacific Northwest wilderness. The Millers were far from wealthy, but their dreams were modest and rooted in family. They were saving for an RV, planning a cross-country trip to show Sophie the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, the Atlantic coast. Road maps with highlighted routes still sat in a kitchen drawer, pages marked with sticky notes where David had scribbled, "Best pie in Montana," or "Stop for sunset here." To those who knew him best, David was grounded. He paid bills on time, never missed Sophie's school plays, called his parents in Idaho every Sunday evening. He wasn't reckless, wasn't the type to disappear on impulse. He was, above all else, a man of promises. And that is why his absence cut so deeply. Emily told investigators, David never broke a promise. Not to me, not to Sophie. If he said he'd be home for dinner, he would be, always. When the news came that he hadn't returned from Rockview Island, those who loved him could not accept theories of abandonment. This wasn't just a name on a manifest or a blurred memory on a hiking trail. This was a husband, a father, a son. His story wasn't about secrets or escape. It was about how an ordinary life, carefully built, could be torn from its foundation in a single afternoon. That ordinariness, the routines, the family dinners, the weekend hikes, became the most haunting detail of all, Because if a man like David Miller could vanish without a trace, then safety itself, the idea of a predictable life, suddenly felt like an illusion. The choice itself seemed harmless. In July 2012, David Miller had wrapped up a 3-day work conference in Portland. It was a routine trip. PowerPoint slides, hotel coffee, polite small talk, and fluorescent-lit ballrooms. By the final morning, he found himself with a free day before his evening flight back to Seattle. Most of his colleagues were already heading home. David, restless from hours indoors, wanted one last breath of the Pacific before returning to the ordinary rhythm of office life. At the hotel desk, he asked for suggestions. Aiden, the clerk, a young woman flipping through a brochure stand, pointed to a glossy flyer, Rockview Island. Oregon's hidden gem, just 2 hours by ferry, the pamphlet promised scenic trails, fresh seafood, and a lighthouse standing guard against the endless ocean. "You'll be back by dinner," she assured him. It was exactly the kind of outing David loved. Simple, outdoors, camera in hand. On the phone with Emily that morning, his voice was cheerful. "One last adventure before I get home," he said. "I'll call you from the airport tonight." He spoke with the easy certainty of a man who had kept every promise before. He packed light, a day bag, a Nikon camera, a water bottle, sunscreen, no extra clothes, no camping gear. His plan was not elaborate. It was a detour, nothing more. At the dock, fellow passengers later recalled a tall man waiting in line, adjusting the strap of his backpack. He didn't stand out. Why would he? He was just another tourist heading for a summer afternoon escape. The ferry ride was uneventful. Families posed for photos with gulls circling in the background. A group of students shared chips, laughter carrying across the deck. Somewhere among them, David leaned against the railing, watching the Oregon coastline fade into the horizon. Perhaps he thought about Emily's cooking, or Sophie's bedtime story waiting for him that night. Rockview Island was marketed as safe, even quaint, a place where retirees strolled boardwalks and children built sandcastles. Locals joked you could walk its perimeter in half a day. For David, it was supposed to be nothing more than an interlude, a handful of photographs to show his family. Yet choices that seem small often become turning points. Boarding that ferry, David could not have imagined he was stepping into the last confirmed hours of his life. The irony was cruel. This wasn't a reckless leap, not a dangerous climb, or a trip into the unknown. It was a single day on a tourist island. Exactly the kind of safe, predictable activity that thousands undertake every summer. And yet, within hours, he would be gone. No phone call home, no flight boarded, no explanation. Later, Emily would replay that decision over and over. If he had just stayed in Portland, if he had come straight home, she whispered. But hindsight offers no comfort. What begins as an ordinary choice can, without warning, become the moment everything changes. For David Miller, that choice was Rockview Island, a simple day trip that became the edge of a mystery no one has been able to solve. By midday, the ferry groaned into Rockview Harbor, its horn echoing across the cliffs. The dock bustled with energy as passengers poured down the gangway. Families balanced coolers and beach umbrellas. Teenagers darted ahead with smartphones held high. Retirees clutched cameras, eager to capture the lighthouse in the distance. The smell of salt and diesel hung thick in the air, layered with something sweeter. Clam chowder bubbling in food stands, fish sizzling on open grills. Rockview Island looked every bit the summer postcard. Wooden signs pointed the way: Harbor Walk, Volcano Ridge Trail, Ocean View Point. Bright banners flapped above souvenir stalls selling t-shirts, seashell necklaces, and saltwater taffy. Seagulls wheeled overhead, bold enough to dive after scraps. Children shrieked with delight as waves slapped against the pier. David Miller stepped onto the dock with his camera bag slung over his shoulder. To onlookers, he blended seamlessly into the tide of tourists. A young couple from California later recalled a polite man who nodded as they offered to snap his picture. To them, he seemed relaxed, just another day tripper chasing a bit of Oregon sunshine. The island itself was small, just a few square miles, but its landscape was diverse. Dense evergreens pressing against trails, jagged cliffs falling away into the Pacific, and a ridge carved from ancient volcanic rock. Locals often said you could walk around the whole island in half a day, though the twisting trails could confuse anyone unfamiliar with the terrain. For seasoned hikers like David, it was the perfect mix, manageable, photogenic, filled with small discoveries. Visitors spread out quickly, some drifting toward the seafood shacks, others climbing toward the overlook, where the lighthouse stood sentinel. The chatter of tourists faded as the crowds dispersed, replaced by the rhythmic wash of waves and the call of distant birds. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow, where the worries of the mainland, emails, meetings, mortgages, felt far away. A father corralled his kids for an ice cream photo. A group of college students raced to the ridge, laughing breathlessly. And somewhere in that swirl of ordinary moments, David began his day on Rockview. No one took special note of him. Why would they? He wasn't loud, wasn't unusual, just a man with a camera, pausing to take in the sweep of the horizon. His Nikon captured the same scenes that filled postcards on the racks. Whitecaps breaking against basalt cliffs, sunlight dancing on the water, gulls frozen mid-flight. Looking back, investigators tried to stitch those hours into a pattern. Did he head straight for the ridge? Did he stop first for lunch? Did he wander the harbor shops before setting off inland? The truth is, no one could say with certainty. The island held him briefly in its ordinary embrace, the way it did thousands of visitors every summer. And yet, for David, this was no postcard escape. Behind the cheerful veneer of Rockview, within its narrow trails and hidden coves, lay the stage for something inexplicable. A place where a man could walk off a ferry at noon, and by sunset, vanish as though he had never been there at all. At 2:15 p.m., the timeline of David Miller's life narrowed to a single, irrefutable moment. Inside a cramped souvenir shop just off Rockview's harbor boardwalk, he made what would become his last confirmed act. The receipt was clear, one silver gold keychain, $12.99, paid with his Visa card. The shop itself was like dozens along the Oregon coast. Postcards of the lighthouse stacked in racks, jars of saltwater taffy and pastel wrappers, shelves crowded with T-shirts printed "I Hearts Rockview." The air smelled faintly of sunscreen, pine air freshener, and salt carried in on the breeze each time the door opened. The clerk that day, a middle-aged woman who had worked summers on the island for years, remembered him faintly when police questioned her later. Polite, quiet. "He thanked me," she said. She recalled a tall man with short brown hair, a small bag slung across his shoulder. At first, she was certain it was mid-afternoon, maybe just after 2. Weeks later, pressed again, her certainty unraveled. Perhaps it was closer to 1:30, or nearer to 3. Memory blurred where paper did not. The receipt became the cornerstone of the investigation. It placed David inside that shop, wallet in hand, alive and well. Beyond that, every account grew slippery. Other customers offered fragments. A teenager buying candy remembered someone tall at the counter, but couldn't recall his face. A father with 2 kids said the store was crowded, too busy to notice details. One woman vaguely recalled hearing a man's voice say, "Thank you," though she admitted she couldn't be sure it was him. Yet the object itself remained. An ordinary keychain, the kind countless tourists bought and forgot in drawers back home. For Emily, the knowledge was unbearable. "It means he was alive, making plans to come home," she told investigators. Torori, who buys a souvenir if they don't expect to leave? That small trinket, meant as a token of a day trip, became something else entirely. A relic, the last anchor to David's confirmed existence. Detectives later admitted how strange it felt to hinge an entire timeline on such a trivial object. You want a trail of evidence. Footprints, video, phone pings, one officer said. Instead, we had a keychain. From the moment he left that shop, the record dissolved into speculation. Did he turn right toward the ridge trail? Did he stop for chowder at the shack by the pier? Did he walk to the overlook where the lighthouse cut a line across the horizon? No one could say for sure. The receipt was hard fact. Everything after was fog. And so, in the investigation that followed, the keychain, an object meant to remember, became the very symbol of forgetting. It marked the last second anyone could prove David Miller was alive. From then on, the island swallowed him whole. Beyond the souvenir shop receipt, David Miller's trail fractured into a dozen unreliable threads. Investigators pieced together statements, but every account seemed to shift like sand. A college student from California swore she saw a tall man in a dark t-shirt on the trail to Volcano Ridge. He had a small backpack, maybe black, she said at first. She was sure it was between 2 and 2:30. Weeks later, her certainty cracked. Maybe it was closer to 3. Maybe he was heading toward the lighthouse overlook, not the ridge at all. By the time she testified again, her memory had become less a photograph and more a blur. A ferry worker thought he remembered a foreign-sounding man asking when the last boat left. Could it have been David? He was tall, I think, maybe brown hair, or dark. Hard to tell, he admitted. With hundreds of day trippers cycling through Rockview each weekend, one questioner blended into the next. The owner of a seafood shack claimed a man ate alone at a corner table around 3:30 p.m. Chowder, soda, quick meal, then gone. Was it David? Could have been, the owner shrugged. But he barely talked, just kept his head down. Lots of guys come through here. Under follow-up questioning, the details unraveled. What color shirt? Couldn't remember. Facial hair? Maybe, maybe not. Even the time wavered. He admitted it might have been closer to 4. Each sighting contradicted the others. If David had hiked the ridge, there was little time for chowder. If he had eaten, there was less chance he'd reach the cliffs. If he asked about the ferry at 3, why didn't he return for it at 4:45? Investigators mapped the island, drawing lines where each witness claimed to see him. The paths intersected, diverged, overlapped in impossible ways. At one point, David seemed to be in 3 places at once, on a ridge trail, at the harbor, and in a seafood shack. For Emily, reading through the statements later was torture. They all saw him, but none of them really did, she said. It was as though her husband had been transformed into a ghost wandering the island, recognizable but never concrete. Memory is fragile, especially under stress. Detectives knew witnesses often remembered what they thought they saw, not what truly happened. Faces blurred, times shifted, details collapsed. Rockview's bustle on a summer afternoon made it worse. Crowds, heat, the distraction of a vacation. And yet, these fragments were all the case had. A man who had clearly bought a keychain at 2:15 was suddenly scattering across testimony like broken glass. Which piece, if any, belonged to him? The result was confusion, not clarity. Instead of tightening the circle around David's last movements, every new voice widened it. It was as if the island itself was conspiring to erase him. Not with silence, but with noise. Too many versions, too many contradictions, and somewhere between them, the truth slipped out of reach. From the moment David Miller bought that silver gull keychain at 2:15 p.m., the clock began to tick. The ferry manifest showed he had a reserve spot on the 4:45 boat back to the mainland. That left roughly 2.5 hours. A span investigators later called the dead hours. In theory, 150 minutes is not much. On an island the size of Rockview, a person could hike to the ridge, eat a meal, and still return in time for the ferry. Dozens of tourists did just that on July 14, 2012. Yet for David, those hours dissolved into silence. Detectives reconstructed possibilities. If he left the shop and headed toward Volcano Ridge immediately, he could have reached the overlook by 3. Witnesses claimed to have seen a tall man on that trail. But if so, why did no one remember him descending? The ridge path funneled hikers onto the same return route. People should have noticed. If he lingered near the harbor, maybe grabbing a late lunch, the seafood shack owner's account could make sense. That would have placed him steps from the ferry dock by 3:30. But then what? Touring? Did he wander again, losing track of time, only to miss the final call? The crew insisted his name was called loudly, more than once. Some speculated he walked toward the cliffs on the island's south side. It was beautiful but treacherous. Jagged basalt, sudden drops, currents below. A misstep there could have been fatal. Yet Coast Guard divers scoured those waters for days, and nothing surfaced. No clothing, no camera, no trace. Phone records offered no lifeline. David's cell pinged once on the island, then went dark. No texts, no calls. It was as if the device had been switched off or destroyed. His Nikon camera was never found either, erasing what might have been the most objective witness to his last hours. For Emily, those 150 minutes became an endless torment. If I just knew what he did in those hours, she said later. If he ate, if he hiked, if he sat somewhere and watched the waves, anything, it would be something I could hold on to. But the timeline stayed blank. The ferry horn blew at 4:45. Families streamed back on board, clutching souvenirs, sandy shoes, melting ice cream cones. The crew checked each name, crossing passengers off. They called his once, twice, 3 times. Silence. Then the gangway lifted, the ropes fell, and the vessel pulled away, leaving one name uncrossed. In the end, the dead hours were not just empty time. They were the black hole into which an ordinary man disappeared. When the 4:45 ferry reached the mainland, the crew expected little more than the usual shuffle of cars and foot passengers heading back toward Portland. Families gathered their coolers, teenagers checked phones, parents soothed tired children, but one line on the manifest remained unchecked: David Miller. At first, the crew assumed a simple mistake. Maybe he had taken an earlier boat. Maybe he had changed plans, deciding to spend the night on the island, but when luggage handlers confirmed there was no overnight bag checked under his name, and when airport staff in Portland reported he never arrived for his evening flight, the situation shifted from inconvenience to alarm. By 9 p.m., the call reached Emily Miller in Seattle. She was tucking Sophie into bed when her phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm. "Mrs. Miller, your husband hasn't boarded his flight. Do you know if he extended his trip?" For Emily, the words were like ice water. David had promised he would be home tonight. He never broke promises. Within hours, the Coast Guard was notified. A small police unit on Rockview Island began sweeping the harbor and nearby shops with flashlights. They searched bathrooms, waiting rooms, even storage sheds in case someone had collapsed or become disoriented. Ferry workers walked the dock, calling his name into the dark, their voices swallowed by the crash of waves. When nothing surfaced, the search widened. By midnight, volunteers with headlamps combed the ridge trails. The wind carried the sharp notes of whistles across the cliffs, punctuating the steady roar of surf. They expected to find something. A shoe, a camera, a sign of a fall. Instead, there was nothing. Emily arrived the next morning, traveling on the first available flight to Oregon. Exhausted but determined, she met officers at the dock with a photo of David in her hand. She moved from shop to shop, showing his face, asking the same question again and again. "Did you see him yesterday? Did he come back here?" Shopkeepers shook their heads with sympathy. Ferry workers avoided her eyes. Every no cut deeper. Back in Seattle, news spread quickly. Neighbors gathered in the Miller's driveway, stunned. Candlelight vigils were organized almost immediately. Friends who knew David as reliable and grounded could not comprehend the idea of him vanishing without a trace. "It doesn't make sense," one coworker told a reporter. David was solid. He wasn't reckless. He was supposed to come home. By the end of the second day, Rockview Island was swarming with activity. Helicopters hovered over cliffs. Divers searched the coves. Search and rescue dogs scoured the trails. Officials marked off grids on maps, determined to cover every inch of the island. Yet the results were the same: silence. The alarm had become undeniable. This was no delay, no change of plans. David Miller was missing. And the mystery of how a man could walk off a ferry at noon, live a day like any other tourist, and then fail to return by evening had just begun to haunt not only his family, but the entire community watching. The first night was chaotic, a collision of urgency and confusion. Rockview Island was small, but the terrain was unforgiving. Dense pines, jagged cliffs, narrow trails that forked into confusing loops. Local officers, just 3 men accustomed to petty thefts and lost pets, suddenly found themselves responsible for a missing American tourist whose name was already hitting the Seattle Evening News. They started simple. Flashlights swept through the harbor, along the boardwalk, into storage sheds and locked restrooms. Ferry crew members retraced their steps, convinced they had somehow missed David in the commotion. His name had been called 3 times. Could he have been in the crowd, unseen? Each corner searched only deepened the unease. By midnight, the Coast Guard joined in. A small patrol boat circled the southern cliffs, its spotlight combing the black water. On shore, volunteers formed a line across the trailheads, moving slowly, calling his name into the trees. The sound of whistles and the bark of search dogs pierced the night air. Locals who had never heard of David Miller hours earlier now carried his photo in their pockets. Dawn brought reinforcements. Helicopters from the mainland skimmed the ridge, blades chopping the salty air as searchers scanned for clothing, movement, anything. Divers dropped into the coves, where currents surged dangerously between rocks. The island was divided into grids, each assigned to a team. No stretch of sand or patch of forest was left unchecked. Emily Miller stood at the dock through it all, clutching a photo of her husband. When a searcher emerged from the forest shaking his head, she bit her lip until it bled. When divers returned to shore empty-handed, she turned away, tears sliding down her face, but she refused to leave. "He's here somewhere," she whispered to anyone who asked. He wouldn't just walk away. For 3 days, the island became a hive of search and speculation. Reporters arrived, their vans clogging the narrow streets, cameras capturing every helicopter pass and every tearful plea. The community, normally defined by its summer tourists and quiet winters, was suddenly at the center of a national story. Yet, despite the scale, the results were the same. Nothing. No backpack. No shoe prints. Not even the camera David carried everywhere. The silence became louder than any clue. By the end of the first week, exhaustion set in. Officials admitted they had searched every trail, every cove, every ridge. The Coast Guard reported the currents would have carried a body out to sea by now, and still no trace had appeared. What should have been a closed loop, a small island, a finite space, was behaving like an open void. For Emily and Sophie, watching from the motel window, it was unbearable. The world outside was filled with motion. Dogs, helicopters, boats, reporters. Yet their lives stood still, and so, Rockview's search ended where it had begun, with questions louder than answers. How could a man vanish so completely from a place so small? When the official search expanded, the story shifted from a mystery on an island to a crisis for an American family. Emily Miller boarded the morning ferry to Rockview with trembling hands, clutching a worn photograph of her husband. The sea air stung her face, but she barely noticed. All she could think was that David was out there. Hurt, confused, waiting for her. At the dock, officers met her with grim professionalism. They spoke in clipped phrases. "We're doing everything we can. The Coast Guard is involved. Please stay hopeful." But Emily heard what wasn't said. No evidence, no progress, no sign of life. She walked the harbor in a daze, showing David's picture to shopkeepers and tourists. Some shook their heads with pity. Others avoided her eyes. Each sorry no felt like a door slamming shut. Back in Seattle, their daughter Sophie clung to her grandmother's hand during a candlelight vigil. The front yard filled with neighbors, co-workers, even strangers, each holding a candle that flickered against the night. A classmate's mother bent down and asked Sophie gently, "Do you miss your daddy?" The 8-year-old's reply cut through the silence. "He promised to read me my story tonight." The crowd wept. David's parents arrived from Idaho days later, weary but resolute. His father, a retired teacher with a methodical mind, spread maps across the motel desk, drawing grids, calculating walking times, arguing over terrain. His mother carried a rosary, murmuring prayers at dawn and dusk. They searched the island on foot, retracing steps already scoured by police, unwilling to accept that nothing had been overlooked. Reporters began circling Emily, thrusting microphones toward her. Footage of her calling David's name along the cliffside aired nationwide. Some viewers saw her desperation, others her strength. Either way, the Millers' private grief became a public story, watched by millions. "This isn't just a headline," Emily said through tears. "This is my husband. This is Sophie's father. Please, don't let him disappear twice." Nights were the hardest. In the motel room, Emily sat awake listening to the surf pounding against the island's edge, imagining David out there somewhere in the dark. She wrote notes to herself. Questions for the police, details she didn't want to forget, prayers she couldn't bring herself to say aloud. As the days passed, hope collided with exhaustion. Emily's voice grew hoarse from repeating his name into the wind. Sophie drew pictures of their family with a missing figure in the middle, her crayons pressing hard enough to tear the paper. The grandparents moved more slowly, but still climbed trails with aching knees, convinced that faith and persistence might succeed where official teams had failed. The island's smallness, once marketed as charming, now mocked them. How could a place so contained hide a man so completely? For the Millers, Rockview was no longer a summer destination. It was a labyrinth of unanswered questions, a place where every tree and stone whispered a possibility, yet none gave them the truth. The family's presence changed the search from an operation to a vigil. Their grief humanized the case, turning it from a local headline into a national story. And as cameras captured their pain, one question echoed louder than all others. If someone like David Miller could vanish in daylight on an island surrounded by witnesses, what did that mean for the rest of us? Months turned into years, yet the name David Miller lingered in headlines, forums, and whispered conversations. At first, the media returned to Rockview Island every summer. Cameras pointed at the harbor where he was last seen. For a time, it seemed impossible that such a story could fade. But slowly, the spotlight shifted elsewhere. New tragedies filled the airwaves. The Millers were left with silence. 8 months after the disappearance, a woman who ran a small inn near the harbor came forward. She swore she had seen a tall man, alone, staring out at the ocean long after the last ferry had left. It was 8 p.m., she claimed. Hours after David should have been gone, her description was vague. Dark shirt, thin frame, restless posture. Could it have been him? The police reopened their files, retraced her steps, even combed the shoreline again. But 8 months of storms had scoured away anything useful. The claim, while haunting, dissolved into uncertainty. Other tips followed. A drifter in California resembled David. A hiker in Colorado answered to Dave. A man in Nevada spoke quietly, avoiding eye contact, as though hiding a past. Emily followed each lead, sometimes flying across states, sometimes driving all night. Each time, her hope carried her forward. Each time, reality brought her to tears. None of them were David. Witnesses' memories grew brittle with time. The souvenir clerk who once swore David came in around 2 now wondered if it was closer to 1, or maybe 3. The college student who described him on the Ridge Trail admitted she wasn't sure if it was even the same day. The seafood shack owner shrugged when asked again. Honestly, I can't remember anymore. That summer was busy. They all blur together. The erosion of memory became its own kind of cruelty. What had once been firm testimony turned slippery. The more Emily pressed, the more it seemed the island itself conspired to forget. Meanwhile, life outside the case kept moving. Sophie grew into adolescence, the absence of her father shaping her milestones. She learned to drive, attended prom, and walked across a graduation stage without him in the crowd. She told a reporter once, her voice breaking, "Every birthday, I hope he'll just walk through the door, that he'll say he's sorry he was late. And I know that's crazy, but I can't stop." For Emily, the years were a cycle of grief and resolve. Some mornings she woke with fresh determination, combing through old case files, writing to detectives, searching online forums for theories. Other mornings, the weight was unbearable. She would sit with David's old Nikon camera bag, still stored in the closet, whispering prayers that he might have used it one last time before he disappeared. The island itself changed. New hotels rose. The wooden pier was rebuilt. Tourists who arrived a decade later had no idea of the mystery buried in its history. Only locals remembered. Some with pity, some with skepticism, all with a trace of unease. And yet, for Emily and Sophie, time did not blunt the wound. It only deepened the emptiness. The longer David remained missing, the harder it became to imagine him alive. Yet the harder it became to accept he was gone. It was the cruelest paradox of all, living every day in the shadow of absence, caught between hope and despair, knowing the world had moved on but their lives never could. By 2025, 13 years had passed since David Miller vanished from Rockview Island. The world had changed. New presidents, new wars, new technologies. But for his family, time had frozen on that July afternoon. His name remained in police archives, his photos still pinned to missing person databases, his face unchanged while everyone else grew older. The case had long gone cold, but speculation never truly died. Three main theories emerged, debated endlessly in online forums and whispered in news documentaries. The first was the simplest, an accident. Rockview's cliffs were steep, the tides unforgiving. A slip could have sent him crashing into the sea, his body swept away in currents too strong for divers. Many called this the most logical explanation, though Emily resisted it. If he fell, there'd be something. His camera, his backpack, his shoes. The ocean doesn't take everything, she told a journalist. The second theory was medical. Perhaps heat stroke, dehydration, or a sudden heart attack on the trails. If he collapsed in an isolated thicket, even the extensive grid search might have missed him. Yet 13 years later, no hiker had stumbled across bones, clothing, or gear. The island wasn't vast wilderness. It was walked by thousands every summer, for nothing to surface strained belief. The third theory was the most unsettling, that David chose to disappear, a voluntary vanishing. Skeptics pointed to his solitary nature, the stress of family and work, the possibility of a hidden depression, but those closest to him rejected it outright. His father called it nonsense. His co-workers described him as stable. Emily was firm. David wasn't the type to walk away. He had a daughter who was his whole world. And so the theories remained, circling without conclusion. Each held a piece of logic, but none could explain the complete erasure of a man so ordinary, so rooted. Meanwhile, Sophie grew into adulthood. At 21, she carried both the burden of memory and the sharp edges of absence. She kept her father's Nikon camera on a shelf in her apartment, though she had never once used it. "It feels wrong," she said softly in a rare interview. "Like if I take a picture with it, I'm erasing what he left behind." Emily, now in her 40s, had never remarried. Her friends urged her to move on, to let go, but she remained tethered to the unresolved. On the 13th anniversary, she returned to Rockview Harbor. Standing on the rebuilt pier, she stared at the horizon where the ferry disappeared each night. Tourists bustled past her, laughing, snapping photos, unaware of the history beneath their feet. She whispered into the wind, "David, if you're out there, if you can hear me, we're still waiting." The local police, now staffed by a younger generation, admitted few even remembered the case. The old files gathered dust in a storage room. But on the internet, the story lived on. Reddit threads, YouTube videos, true crime podcasts, all revisited the same haunting detail. His name was on the list, but he never came home. For most, it was a chilling story, a puzzle with no solution. For the Millers, it was life itself. 13 years of birthdays, graduations, and holidays marked by an empty chair. In the end, David Miller became both a man and a metaphor. A man who stepped off a ferry for a day trip and never returned. and a metaphor for how fragile normalcy is, how quickly the familiar can collapse into the incomprehensible. His absence left not just a mystery, but a reminder, sometimes the most ordinary choices. A day trip, a souvenir, a hike, can be the doorway into a story without an ending. 13 years have passed, and David Miller's story remains suspended in time. His name still sits on a passenger list. His photograph still smiles from missing person posters. His family still lives between hope and heartbreak. On Rockview Island, tourists sip coffee and buy trinkets where he once stood. Most have never heard his name, but for Emily and Sophie, every day is a reminder that he was real and that he is still missing. Perhaps one day the truth will surface. A forgotten witness will remember more clearly, a hiker will stumble across a long-lost clue, or the ocean itself will give back what it took. Until then, David Miller's story is more than a mystery. It is a mirror, reminding us how fragile our ordinary days really are. How quickly a family dinner, a bedtime promise, a ferry ride can fracture into silence. As we remember David, we also remember the families still waiting for answers, still holding candles in the dark. Their stories matter. Their voices matter, and they deserve not to be forgotten. If this story touched you, please like this video, subscribe to Silent Traces, and share it with others. Because when we keep these stories alive, we carry their memory forward. And maybe, just maybe, help bring someone home.